Well, to speak more on the situation, Ali Mashon, former MI5 agent and intelligence expert, joins us now on the programme. Hello there, Ali. The Metropolitan Police have taken the word terrorism from their recent statement on the stabbing. Is this an indication on where the investigation may be going, do you think?
I think that the distinction between mental health issues and terrorism is a false dichotomy. There is obviously a blurring between the two categories. Someone can be mentally unstable, but can then read from a distance of encouragement by some sort of terrorist group to carry out a lone wolf attack. So I think it's wrong for them to say it's an either-or. Often I think there is a blending of both, as we've seen in many other attacks, not only in Europe, but also last year in London, when there was a similar knife attack in Leytonstone tube station, and that was initially called a terrorist attack, and then during the trial, the accused turned out to have mental health problems. So I think it's interesting that initially everyone assumes it's terrorism. Now they're sort of rolling it back a bit. However, that doesn't mean it's not terrorism. They just need to dig a bit more.
The attacks across Europe of late have some similarities. The use of low-tech weapons, for instance. Is that a sign of a spontaneous action done without planning, do you think?
Not at all. I mean, this is exactly the sort of tactic that ISIS has been calling on its adherents to try and follow. Because, of course, if you have a lone wolf attack, there is no need to plan, there is no need to communicate with any other cell members. So actually you can sort of fly under the radar much more easily as a lone wolf attacker. It's a bit like with the Nice attack as well. The encouragement to use vehicles as weapons is obvious, it's low-tech. It doesn't require too much planning, but it can be devastatingly effective. So I think this is a certain tactic that ISIS has certainly been encouraging its followers to use.
Top UK officials have been speaking about the increased threat for months now. Let's just take a listen together to what's been said.
Terrorist attack is possible.
The UK's job harder, I think, to protect the citizens from threats of terrorism.
Daesh poses a severe threat.
We would miss the point that the cancer of Islamist extremist violence is damaging our world and our country.
Security threat to all countries, including Britain.
In this country, we've changed the threat level to severe.
Are there limitations to security in the UK? I mean, is there anything preventing the adequate preparations against attacks or the deployment of officers? We know that an elite unit was deployed just yesterday in order to stop attacks on the streets of London.
Indeed, yes. I think the UK's experience specifically, thinking back even to the 1970s, 80s and 90s when they were under considerable attack from the Provisional IRA, meant that they became quite over-reliant on electronic surveillance, for example, because those organisations did operate within cell structures, and that was an effective way to try and find out preemptive intelligence to try and stop attacks. When you're looking at lone wolf attacks, low-tech attacks as well, it's virtually impossible to stop. So I'm sure people will be reassured to see more armed police on the streets, but realistically, what can they do? Yes, if someone goes on a shooting spree, you get rapid response, which is good and can potentially save lives. However, if someone is carrying a suicide vest or a suitcase bomb, as we saw in Belgium earlier this year, or someone goes on a knife attack, the response can be quicker, but it cannot obviate the threat, and it cannot obviate the murders that are committed before the interception by police. So it is a balance.
Earlier, the head of London's Metropolitan Police warned that a terror attack in Britain was inevitable, his words. Could this killing increase that likelihood? Because if we bring up the example of Germany, we saw a kind of knock-on effect, didn't we, when the first attack occurred, 4 more followed within the same week. That's a fear now.
Absolutely. And again, you know, most of those were lone wolf, low-tech attacks. And it turned out that, you know, many of these people had already been on the police radar, if not on the intelligence services radar. The same with the French attacks. I would not be surprised if it turns out that this suspect was already known to police, at least in some capacity, be it, you know, dabbling in low-level crime or whatever. There seems to be a sort of Venn diagram of overlaps between known minor criminality, perhaps slight mental instability, and potentially interest in the teachings and the tactics of ISIS. And that seems to be going on increasingly across the European mainland, and I think it could indeed start appearing more and more often in the UK. I mean, only, 2 weeks ago, we saw a kidnap attempt against a serviceman outside an RAF base.
Yeah, just finally, Scotland Yard has told Londoners to run as far away as possible and hide in case of a terror attack. What's your take on that advice?
I think it's very good advice, because what else can you do? The problem is when something ghastly happens, most people freeze. Everyone thinks the instinct is to run, but most people are just so shocked they freeze, and that is when they're most vulnerable. So yes, if you can sort of think yourself into that mentality, get away as quickly as possible, get cover as quickly as possible, you have a better chance of survival.
OK, the thoughts of Annie Machon, former MI5 agent and intelligence expert. Thanks for coming on the programme. We are, of course, keeping across this developing story, and we'll bring you all the details as they continue to come into us on RT.
We should learn to live with terrorism. We are facing a war that terrorism has started against us.
The entire EU is Germany. Its focal point is the target of international terrorism. And we have to expect attacks by small groups of radicalized lone operators.
Moving on to other news this Thursday afternoon here in Moscow. 2 chemical attacks have hit Syria in recent days and were carried out by a US-backed moderate rebel group. That's according to the Russian Defense Ministry.
On August the 2nd, a poisonous substance was dispersed in a residential quarter of the Salah ad-Din district in the eastern part of Aleppo. The substance came from the area of Sehari, controlled by the militant group Harakat Nur al-Din al-Zenki, which is referred to by the US as the so-called moderate opposition. Russia's Reconciliation Center in Syria has informed Washington about the incident.
Well, 7 people were killed and 23 people hospitalized in Aleppo with inhalation injuries. RT went to the US State Department's briefing to ask if Washington views the rebel group's attack as an act of terror.
The recent chemical attack in Syria was carried out by an organization called Nur al-Din al-Zenki. This is an organization supported by the United States as it fights to topple the Syrian government as part of the so-called moderate opposition. This is not the first time this organization has been involved in atrocities. Recently, a video surfaced of a 12-year-old Syrian boy purportedly being beheaded by members of the group. Now, that video is a little too graphic to show on television. After that video surfaced, representatives of the U.S. State Department said they were reconsidering whether or not the United States would continue supporting the organization.
If we can prove that this was indeed what happened and this group was involved in it, I think it would certainly give us pause.
Now, I recently went to the State Department and asked whether or not, now this chemical attack has taken place, the United States would officially change its policy and stop supporting this organization. Now, here's what happened at the State Department. Is the United States still supporting this organization?
I don't have in front of me that we actually fund them. I mean, you're saying we provide them with assistance?
Yes, as part of the so-called moderate opposition.
Yeah. I don't know what.
Now, the group
again,
also.
I haven't seen the allegations yet, so I think it's too early for me to A, make that assessment, and B, make that connection. Again, these are not easy processes, and one incident here and there would not necessarily make you a terrorist group. For a terrorist organization, there are fundamental actions, one of which is an intention to carry out terrorist attacks, both within Syria, but as well as on the West. Look, we're constantly evaluating their behavior.
Just to be clear, if a group was using chemical weapons, their funding would be cut off.
Again, I will not make any statements of one or the other until we know all the facts.
Now, the chemical attack took place in government-controlled areas in the city of Aleppo. What generally happens when people inhale chlorine gas is it causes intense burning in their eyes and in their lungs. It can eventually cause suffocation. This charge of using chemical weapons adds to the gravity of continued U.S. support for this Syrian rebel group.
The rebel group believed to be responsible for the attack in Aleppo is Nur al-Din al-Zenki, and it's just one of many still supported by the U.S. despite several reported atrocities in Syria.
We continue to reach out to these opposition groups to ensure that they are adhering to the cessation and continuing to create the environment for a political transition.
agreed that this group would be a part of the HNC with the expectation that they will not commit violations of the cessation and that they will not carry out brutal attacks.
More than 20 nations agreed that the only groups that would not be party to the cessation of hostilities would be those designated as terrorist organizations by the UN.
The American media don't make it real clear the nature of the groups we're supporting in Syria. We keep hearing about moderate opposition instead of calling them what they are. These are radical Islamic jihad terror groups, the same ones we keep saying we're worried about launching attacks here in the United States. Here we are supporting groups in Syria that have this jihadist ideology, cut off heads of little kids, use chemical weapons, and I don't think the American people really make the connection because our media does not report it. These are not, as far as anybody can tell, weapons-grade gas attacks. It's at least from what I've heard of the news reports, seems to be more of the, as they call it, kitchen gas variety that is certainly within the capabilities of these terrorist groups. It makes perfect sense that that's where it would come from, and frankly, I don't think it's going to wash with anybody here.